It's really great that we can have this opportunity to come and talk to you tonight and really talk about a topic that I've seen manifest in many different ways, not only in the way history is portrayed, but in the way it has impacted myself personally and people in my community, and the way it impacts our relationships that we have with the people around us and with the people in the schools, with the parents, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I really want to get into you obviously you understand the general topic, but before I do that, I want to just give you a little bit of a picture. If you're not familiar with California Indians or with the Kumeyaay, California is an incredibly diverse geographical area. The closest thing that I've heard it described to is Papua New Guinea, as far as the diversity of cultures and languages that you find here. So there are just hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of stories of different cultures and different histories and different interactions that occurred over time. And so the idea that there's one narrative of priests coming and founding missions and that, that becomes the story that is then handed off from there. It's really laughable when you look at this, and when you see even a tiny bit, and there are some books that have gone out and surveyed many different cultures. Sometimes I think there's one that's 20 or 30 cultures. You see this incredible diversity, and you see similarities, because a lot of people have similarities with other tribes because we lived in the same type of environment, or the same type of habitat. We had the same type of food supplies, or the same type of ocean resources or desert resources, and so you see a lot of similarities. There was a lot of communication, a lot of trade that occurred, cultural communication across different boundaries. And yet there's linguistic distinction that you see even among tribes that are in the same language family. That as a population stays in one area over a longer and longer period of time, you start getting more and more variation. And what linguists have found in California is you can have a dramatic change even in the same language family, going from one valley to another valley, just a matter of a few miles. And so that tells you that people were in this place for a very, very long time to have that kind of diversity. And so that's just a little picture of California. Of course, I'm going to focus on the Kumeyaay. So this is our traditional territory, and you can see in the north of the international border are the reservations in the United States. South are the ejidos in Mexico. We've also, over time, we've had some populations that have been outside that, and there's some cross-hatched areas there that we had a population of agricultural Kumeyaay who were affiliated with the Quechan over toward the desert, and there were populations at various times that had some interaction and were allied with the Kokopah over in their territory. So we also had a population in more recent times with the Santa Catarina people, the Pai Pai, down just south of our border. So, and this border is, it was not a hard border. There was no real wall there. This is more of a fuzzy boundary as on the territory we mark it now. And sometimes, people get upset because they say, "Hey, I know our tribe used to go hunt over in this area here, or we used to go and mine soapstone over in that area there," and so people they object sometime when they see that kind of designation being put down. Okay, so the topic of the day: Spanish and Mexican California. What a wonderful story! This romantic dream, caballeros, hidalgos, beautiful young ladies, fatherly friars, and submissive Indians. Man, this is great. Father Sarah, in this Franciscan paradise, presiding over these Indians with love, peace, and harmony. Who can be against that? That's really a wonderful story. Christian missions built one day's march apart, all connected by the El Camino Real. What the vision that people had to plan this out this way, and of course, man, it must have been a real coincidence too that water supplies were just one day apart as they went up the coast and founded these missions, and that Indians just jumped at the chance to be uplifted. Wow, I mean, throw away your traditional practices, throw away your traditional beliefs, throw away your traditional social structure, because here is something that is so much better. We're going to give you a way to uplift, to become a contributing part of Spanish society. You're going to go through these phases. We're going to teach you about Christ, teach you about God, salvation. We're going to teach you about the trades and the crafts. We're going to teach you discipline so that you can be a better participant. So one day you'll be part of this society, part of Spanish society. The missions will give way to pueblos, and we'll have cities, and we'll all be part of the same thing that we're building. Eventually, the missions gave way in the story to the ranchos, and in the popular version of history, you really don't see that. There isn't a lot of explanation of this transition that occurred, and it's really a very interesting transition, and there was an overlap. There were missions that were actually being constructed after Mexico got independence from Spain. So the missions didn't quite die out, although they did really slow down quite a bit, and it wasn't until the Secularization Act that really put the kibosh, it's an old Indian term, on those types of activities. So this is a great story, but as you go into the future from here, what happens to the Indians? How are the Indians part of this story? Well, you got to, why do you even include Indians in this story? Well, you have to, if you're doing this narrative on California, you have to include Indians, because if you're going to have a mission, you got to have somebody that you're being a missionary to. So there has to be somebody that fills that role, and so you have to at least mention the Indians. And even in a lot of the historical dramas that were done, and what do they call them, vivant tableau, or with those there were like living scenes of history that used to be done. I mean, very seldom was the name of the tribe ever mentioned, or if it was a Spanish version that was given to them. For the Kumeyaay, it was Diegueño, so which basically is Diegan. So the Indians around San Diego, Diegans, Diegueños, and not a lot of imagination, but and that was true up the coast. You have Luiseños and Juaneños and Gabrieleños, and so there wasn't even an attempt to carry forward the name of the indigenous people and just collectively to name them for the mission that they were nearby. So we're going to focus on a period of time when this narrative really took root and really started forming in California, which was in the late 1800s, or in 1880s it really started, but it really took root and started going in the 1890s. And it didn't really start out, it seems like it wasn't really geared toward immediately wiping Indians out of the discussion. It's just that Indians just didn't fit in. In the 1892 Cabrillo Festival, they had a lot of Indians there. They had a lot of singers and dancers that came from the different tribes in the area, from the different reservations. There were Luiseños from the northern part of San Diego County and Kumeyaay that came and sang and danced. There's a lot of pictures in the archives here at the History Center of the 1892 celebration. Well, what you see is by 1911, they decided that the indigenous presence, it was represented by Queen Ramona, who sat on a throne next to King Cabrillo at the Cabrillo celebration here as they were laying, this was where as they were laying the first cornerstones of building this area for the exposition. By 1915, it had become even harsher toward the indigenous people. There was an Indian community in Florida Canyon that ended up getting removed from the park because they didn't represent the kind of Indians that they wanted to show in the exposition. So what they did was, over in where the parking lot of the San Diego Zoo is now, they built an Indian village, and it was patterned after Pueblo-style architecture. And they brought almost the entire San Ildefonso Pueblo from New Mexico to come and man the Indian village here. So here the Kumeyaay were getting kicked out, and Indians from New Mexico were being brought in because they were the kind of Indians that they felt people were expecting to see. So in this short period of time, we went from having a large population of people from 1892 to 1915 where they didn't even want us around, let alone be an active participant in the celebration. During this period, there were some other changes that were going on. Now, when you look around California, you see so many Spanish names all over the place. Well, a lot of these Spanish names, in fact, the vast majority of these Spanish names did not get applied to these places until the American period. These were Anglo-Americans who were going around putting Spanish names on everything. And even the places that had Indian names, they changed the spelling in order to make it sound more Spanish. So we have some of these names that, when you look at when the Americans first came and recorded them, they used English spelling, and then they switched to Spanish spelling on them, and others evolved over time. Tecuan, the village of Tecuan, became Tijuana, and then stories sprang up about Tijuana. Well, that must, Tijuana sounds like Tijuana, so a whole story of Tijuana, who was so nice to the travelers that came through the area, and that's how the city got its name. The Indian part, even now, most people from Tijuana don't even know where the origin of the name is. They think it is Tijuana. The Tecate is the big place where you cut wood. Tecate. The Hakum became Hakumba. And the Hamasha is Hamasha. And if you see, of course, some people, they want to pronounce it in Spanish. I think if you use your navigator, it's going to call it Hamacha, because they're going to try to pronounce it as a Spanish word. But it's interesting because most of the people who live down there know you pronounce it Hamasha. And so they'll pronounce it Hamasha, and other people will correct them and say, oh no, I know Spanish. That's not how you say that. It's Hamacha. But it's actually Hamasha is the name, and it's the gorge by the water. The Hamul, Matlahoy, the jewel, La Jolla. No, it's the land with a bunch of holes, a lot of caves. The Matlahoy. But it's a beautiful area, so what's wrong with that? Yeah, okay. Right. So the Indian names, Milshkatai, Campo, the big meadow, Milshkatai. The Americans couldn't say Milsh, so they wrote it Milguatai, which means Bigfoot. So sometimes you see that as the original name of Campo Valley was Bigfoot. It was Milshkatai is the big meadow, and then they actually did a rough translation to Campo. Otai means the weed, and Poway. So we have all of these names, and these are only part of it. There's many more names. There's other stories. One poor story, and you see what was going on with these Americans coming in and trying to translate things too, and sometimes they didn't quite get it right. The Matai Nakus, the grandmother mountain. The Americans came in, said, "What's the name of that mountain?" "Oh, Matai Nakus, the grandmother mountain." And the Americans said, "Oh, okay, well, but we got to Spanishize things. We're gonna give it a Spanish name. So how do you say grandmother?" Well, they didn't know how to say. The person that was doing it was so weak in his Spanish that he said, "We'll call it Madre Grande," and instead of abuela, and so the grandmother mountain, Madre Grande. Well, I guess eventually people figured out that, hey, they kind of got this translation wrong. What are we going to do? Well, people are already calling it that. Well, we got to change. Well, it eventually evolved into Mother Grundy. So this poor mountain ended up getting morphed into Mother Grundy Mountain, and you see these different stories that occurred in these place names and in the histories that went on with it. But it was all part of this thing of emphasizing the Spanish connection and this history that with Spain, and showing it as a continuum that had occurred from Spanish through Mexican through American. Mission revival architecture, Spanish revival architecture. These were things that originated during that time. The mission revival style, 1890, the use of the tile roofs and the adobe structures that eventually gave way to the stucco. But the mission revival eventually morphed into the Spanish revival. The first place where that Spanish revival occurred is right here in Balboa Park. And I'm sure most of you people that are affiliated with the museum are aware of that. And it had a dramatic effect. The Spanish revival architecture has continued into the present day. It spawned copycats in other parts of the United States and in other parts of the world. Even Mexico. Mexico City, some of the structures there were patterned after the Spanish revival architecture that came right here out of Balboa Park, and it went into South America. South Africa even had some adaptations of the Spanish revival architecture. So these were, this was all part of this creation of these routes. So what led to this? What was the impetus? Why were people wanting to create these ties that had such an effect on the way that we view history? Well, one of the biggest effects was caused by the Transcontinental Railroad. So in 1869, Promontory Point, Utah, and you've seen the pictures, and I think they kicked the Chinese out of that one picture where they show them there driving the spike. They let the Irish stay, which, for my Irish side, I'm happy for. Although I think they paid our people in whiskey. So the rail lines were linked there. Well, this has been held up as a great example of Yankee ingenuity and about the perseverance of Americans and the greatness of America and the magnificent feats that it does. And but man, this was one of the worst cases of crony capitalism that you could possibly imagine. The railroad was something, the private sector wouldn't finance it. Nobody needed it. They were shipping freight down to Panama, and there was a train that was taking it across the isthmus, and then they'd ship it back up to the East Coast. I mean, that was a cheap way to go. They didn't really need the railroad. With a railroad, you need stops in between. There were no towns from St. Louis till you got to Utah, and there wasn't that big of a population there. Although the Mormons really did want it, because it was going to be a connection for them. But other than that, there wasn't really much between there. The federal government granted millions and millions of acres to the railroads to basically go in and develop whatever they wanted. And a lot of those were taken directly out of Indian lands. So it was a huge taking of land out of reservations, in some cases leaving them checkerboarded with these railroad sections that had been pulled out. It was so bad in some places that the railroads were being paid by the mile. And so in some places, in order to maximize their profits, they intentionally curved the tracks. So they would have a few extra miles by the time they got their payoff from the government. So it was really, it enriched a few people, and it wouldn't have been done if it wasn't for the lobbying and the ability of people to get the right politicians and on their side in order to have it developed. So the railroad was built, and I think almost immediately the Union Pacific, within a couple of years, was already under protection, under bankruptcy protection. And so they really needed people to use this thing. Please use this thing. They ended up subsidizing in order to get the freight shipping on it, but they really wanted to get, it was actually more lucrative if they could get some passenger traffic coming in. So they wanted people to come to California, people from the East Coast. And how can we attract people into California? Well, if people think of the West, it's the Wild West, and dime novels were all over the place at the time. So you can imagine, people's perception of California, or of the West in general, was really influenced by the dime novel, kind of the Facebook of its day. And so they had all these perceptions about the Wild West, and the railroad wanted to give people a different perception. No, we're tame here. This isn't like out in Wyoming or out Colorado. None of that. This is much more of a civilized place that you'll be coming to out here, and so they needed a way to sell their message. So then the book Ramona was published. So 1884, Helen Hunt Jackson. Now she wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor, which that's a whole nother lecture. But the Century of Dishonor, she went around and looked at Indian communities all over the country. And one of the reasons why she was commissioned to go and do that was because of Little Bighorn in 1776, and that was the centennial of the United States. The United States had just gotten out of a civil war where millions of people had participated, and then to have a unit of the U.S. cavalry killed in battle it shocked people. They said, "What's going on out there? What's going on out in the country? What's going on with the Indians? We thought all that stuff was behind us now. Why there's Indians that are still out there fighting us?" And so that was one of the things that she did, and she highlighted just some of the horrible stories that had occurred in many different areas of the country, and including Southern California. She was especially moved by the way Indian people were treated in society in California, and she. I don't know how much she knew about the earlier history in the 1850s and 1860s, but and the genocide that had occurred here. But she certainly saw the plight that Indians had at the time she came through, and so when there wasn't the reaction to her book, The Century of Dishonor, there wasn't the reaction that she wanted. There wasn't enough that was being done, so there were. She participated with groups like the Indian Rights Association and other white groups that wanted to do something to benefit the Indians. They used to have a conference in New York called the Lake Mohonk Conference, and she really wanted to push for something good to be done with the Indians, and because she had seen so much, especially in Southern California, she decided that she would write a novel that would humanize the Indians in Southern California, to make people feel some compassion for the people here. Well, people loved her book. It was a bestseller. They loved, but not for the reasons that she wanted. They loved it because of the portrayal of this idyllic lifestyle of leisure, this wonderful image of the ranchos, and people imagined themselves in a big rancho with a bunch of Indians working for them, and it was something really great. The railroad promoters said, "Wow, people really like this book. We need to latch onto this. This is our marketing gimmick," and so they started started pushing for the marketing of the Ramona story, and about every town had some kind of story about Ramona, kind of like on the East Coast where you say George Washington slept here, or Thomas Jefferson ate here, or it was this is the house where Ramona grew up. This is the house where Ramona got married. Never mind that she was fictional. Yeah. That didn't matter, and sometimes people would find that out and they'd be really disappointed. But they also wanted to see, well, these were the mission Indians. Where are these missions? And they said, well, we need to put the missions. We need to build them. What happened to the missions? Well, the missions had been gone for 50 years. They had crumbled to ruin. And so the boosters said, no, we need to have these missions here. We have all these tourists that want to come out and they want to see the missions. So there was a big push, and millions of dollars were spent to rebuild the missions. There were no blueprints from the original construction. So There were a few sketches on some of them, and so really none of the missions are actually exact recreations of what was there before. They're all interpretations and incorporations of the mission revival architecture and the Spanish revival architecture that were booming at this time. So, but it gave people that place to go, so they could come out here and they could see the mission. So this would confirm in their minds the idea that the Indians here had disappeared. The Indians had become part of the missions. They were mission Indians, and then they went into the ranchos, and then they kind of just faded off into oblivion after that. This was so popular. There have been, I believe, must be 10 movies that have been made over the years. I think Richard Carrico probably has some of those numbers. But the first one, Mary Pickford, one of the first national movie stars, silent movie era, 1910. She played Ramona. Most recently, that I've been able to find was in 2000. There was a telenovela series in Spanish based on the Ramona characters. So this has been an enduring thing that has, continued to have its impact, and it has an impact in because of the way that it's being portrayed. It gives people this kind of baseline of where they start when they're looking at the Indians in California. They're in their minds, where's the first place they get exposed to something? And if it's through the Ramona story, then they're already starting off with a pretty big distortion. So something like this wouldn't really carry forward unless there was something in it for everybody. I mean, why would you buy into a narrative that is not really true, that doesn't really give you the full story, unless you're getting something out of it? And there were a lot of key players that really saw this as something that they wanted to be a part of. And Spain, just a few years, in the last part of the 1890s, had suffered a major defeat in the Spanish-American War. So this was where the United States had finally become the premier dominant force in the Western Hemisphere, if not the world. We're close to that in the world if we weren't already. And Spain, from its past glory, had really faded, and the humiliation of that defeat had caused so much internal dissension within Spain, the Basques and Catalan and all these different factions. It was tearing the country apart, and they needed something to try to unify themselves. They needed some way to bring people together. So looking back on past glories was one of the ways that they could get the people together. And so when the Spanish revival movement started, it was just a natural. When people said, Spain, could you come and be a part of this? They were more than happy to come and contribute and to back it up and support it and say, oh yes, this is the story. This is our story in California. And even though we were defeated by the United States, at least now we can say that the United States is our progeny. We're part of what made the United States. Just as Britain made the colonies that came from Britain founded the United States on the East Coast, we founded the United States on the West Coast. And so it was a way to save face and to help them internally and to help try to bring the people together in Spain. For the Catholic Church, 1900, there was a lot of suspicion, a lot of distrust of the Catholic Church and of the Pope, of the Papists, the people who followed the Pope. And as this area became part of the United States, this gave the Catholic Church a wonderful opportunity to say, hey, we are also one of the founding religions of the United States. It wasn't just Protestants up in the eastern United States. You got all these Catholics here that were also part of the founding of the United States. So it gave an inclusion. So the more they could promote that origin, that being a part of the creation of California and carrying it forward, the more it benefited them. For the Spanish and Mexicans, it reaffirmed that they were the civilizers, the settlers who came in, and they were the equivalent of the British colonialists. They were the Puritans of the West Coast that came in to found this new society. The railroad was eager, and this was a wonderful opportunity. And for the boosters in California, it gave California a unique legacy. At the time, people looked toward the structure of the United States. Kind of the snob factor was the East Coast. It still is to a certain extent. But you get in New England, and I'm son or daughter of one of the founding fathers or whatever, and you have the different towns and all the stories, the historical stories that go with the Bride of Paul Revere or the Salem witch hunt or all these other different things that go into American history, and it's really part of that origin story. So everybody else is kind of set off to the side, and they're a lesser factor in the social structure. But this gave California a chance to have equal footing, by claiming this origin, by having these missions that continued up into the present. They were inheriting this legacy. They were inheriting the mantle of the conquistadors, men of courage, men of strength, and men of faith, men who had persevered and had carried and tamed the wild in order to create this foundation for the state of California. So wonderful story, wonderful narrative, and there's all these people who have this vested interest in keeping this going and reaffirming it and finding ways to reaffirm it. So even in the historical research, the historians went and looked for things that confirmed these types of perceptions that were there. So you see a lot of the writing that occurred at the time was focused on that. There was another narrative, though, that actually precedes the Spanish Revival narrative, and it kind of got morphed into this, and that's the Aztec Empire. So even as early as the 1600s, when American explorers came down into the Southwest and they saw these ruins of civilizations from the past, they said, well, these Indians that live here could never have done that. They're too primitive. They could never have done this kind of thing. These must be remnants of the Aztec Empire. At one time, this was the Aztec Empire came all the way up here, and they must have withdrawn and allowed these things to go to ruin. So so this perception, this idea that this was all part of the Aztec Empire was carried forward, and there were people like Hubert Bancroft who objected to this vehemently. Of course, he died in 1913, I think, so he didn't. It's too bad, but during the time he was alive and he saw this going on, this false narrative, he really objected to it. He said, "Hey, there's no evidence at all that this was part of the Aztec Empire." Now, there may have been some Uto-Aztecan-speaking people who migrated from what is now the Americas into Mexico and started the Aztec civilization. I don't think anyone really disputed that. But the idea that when they reached their zenith, when they reached their empire stage, that was part of the Aztec Empire was something that was pretty easily disproven. So Bancroft didn't like it, but it was something that got tied into the Spanish revivalism and this pushing of this kind of narrative that really had the emphasis on Spain and then on Mexico and Mexico, the criollos, the people of pure Spanish blood who were born in the Americas, they felt themselves to be the carriers of this domination, this conquest that had occurred previously of the Aztec Empire, and this was a new Aztec Empire. And as they pushed themselves away from Spain, they really wanted to capture that way of viewing it. So this got wrapped into the Spanish revivalism. It didn't really find many homes, but one of them was at San Diego State, and my alma mater. So you can see in the logo for San Diego State the mission that's the tower there at San Diego State was patterned after the Mission Bell Tower. So So these, and the San Diego State mascot became the Aztec. And there was a great master's thesis was done by Ozzie Mong at San Diego State, or Monge. And he, in it, and I paraphrase what he said in his paper, but he called it the Monty Python thought process. But since the Spanish defeated the Aztecs, and the Aztecs once ruled Mexico, then after the Mexican-American War and the U.S. acquired land that was once Mexico, then therefore the Indians who lived in the acquired land must be Aztecs. And you know, what's interesting is that a lot of people really believe that. They thought that the indigenous people in San Diego were the Aztecs. So once again, and here we have Kumeyaay reservations. You know, by this time, most of the Kumeyaay reservations that are in existence were here in San Diego, and yet there's still people who thought this was part of the Aztec Empire. So what did we miss out on? You know, so we have this narrative. So it's, you know, and for some people it's a narrative very dear to their heart, and they just they don't want to lose it. I mean, you know, and in some ways, sometimes I feel for them. I feel like I'm killing Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. It's you know, I mean, it's sad. But what really happened? Well, they didn't build the missions sequentially from south to north. Actually, from San Diego, Sarah went to Monterey, and he bounced around mostly by ship, going to the different areas where the missions were founded. There was never an El Camino Real connecting all the missions. Some of the places, there wasn't even a passable road between missions. There were trails, Indian trails between some of the places, but it was never referred to as the El Camino Real. And researchers have gone in and looked to see, was there ever, can you find any records of money that was allocated for construction on the El Camino Real, or people who surveyed the El Camino Real or did anything with reference to that, and they can't find anything from that period. So where did this come from? Well, it's part of the Spanish revivalism, the whole thing. In the early 20th century, the Camino Real Association and different women's organizations and the Automobile Club of Southern California got together and really pushed for this designation of the El Camino Real and placing of the bell markers on this route. So this was an American invention, a 20th century American invention, is the El Camino Real. And to this day, and I'm a member also of the Auto Club, but we have a mission bell in the center of the logo for the Auto Club. So what happened in the missions? Was it really this peaceful love fest that was occurring? Well, no, Indians were fighting back all throughout the missions, and these are some significant battles, but they're not all of them. There was many more battles that occurred where the Indian people had uprisings on the missions and attacked, and these are just a few of them. And of course, the 1775 San Diego mission being destroyed. That wasn't the first battle, and the first battle was actually about 6 months after the founding of the mission in San Diego, and led by Nawaseho, and Paul Chase wrote a really interesting article about that event, and how it occurred. So there was a tremendous amount of resistance that was occurring from Indian people. The destruction of the mission at San Diego had a tremendous effect. Actually, it destroyed two missions, because the mission at San Juan Capistrano that had just been founded was abandoned when the attack occurred at San Diego. So there were two missions that went out of commission for a while, and then eventually they went back. They refounded San Diego and went back to San Juan Capistrano. So, but in the long term, what it did was it really showed the Spanish that they had to be careful as they were moving east, and they never got further than the El Cajon Valley. So they never did go beyond that, because that was still area that was under Kumeyaay control, and it remained under Kumeyaay control all throughout the Spanish period, and well into in fact through the Mexican period too. So it had a dramatic effect on stopping the expansion of the missions to the east. The Spanish recognized that they could not conquer the Kumeyaay going straight east, so they tried to do an end run. And they went up through the San Luis Rey Valley And they had better relationships with the Luiseños than with the Kumeyaay, and they were able to get far up into the interior, and they founded the mission at San Isabel in 1818. But that was almost toward the end of their of the mission period. And but the intent was, or what they recognized, was that the only way they were ever going to conquer the Kumeyaay was to have a string of missions that were inland, that were 30 or 40 miles inland from the coast through the mountains. That they would have to have that presence there of and have troops in those areas in order to subdue the Kumeyaay, and they were never able to accomplish that. Lieutenant Colonel Fages, very famous, in the early annals of San Diego history, and his description, and he says that, we're, restless, stubborn, haughty, warlike, hostile toward us, absolutely opposed to rational subjection, and to oppose subjection is irrational, I guess. So anyway, but and it's interesting. If you go into history and you're looking at things, this wasn't the only thing written in Mexico. There were other writings that said we were peaceful, we were loving, we loved being in the missions, we loved the priests, we loved the learning about Christ and being filled with the Spirit of God, and so there's other writings that say that. Well, you can imagine who wrote those. Well, it was the priests. That was their reports that went back into Mexico. So when you go in, you got to look at all the material there. You can't just look at one. What was their vested interest? Father Serra wanted his colonies in California to expand. He wanted people to migrate from Mexico into California. In his letters, he would write about how we have a ready population of Christian women waiting for you. Come to California. Come to California and be a part of the of opening up these new lands. And so he couldn't very well say that you might get shot in the process. So he left that part out. So in some ways, where does the truth lie? I would think that as a military commander, Fages probably, he needed ammunition, he needed troops, he needed weapons, and I think he would probably have given a better assessment of the situation than the priests would. But that's my own take on it, and you're welcome to review the documents yourself. But I think the important thing is to look at all these different sides when you're evaluating what occurred during that time. So would the Indians have ever actually been able to achieve this incorporation into the Spanish Empire and to become a part of the citizenry, be tax-paying Spanish citizens? And was this really what the ultimate goal would be? Well, there's no way they were ever going to get that. The Spanish had the caste system, and it was a very involved system. I mean, they had rankings for people. If you were half Indian, half white, you were a mestizo. If a mestizo married a white, then their children were called coyotes. You had all these different combinations. If you're fourth black, fourth Indian, half white, you got one name. If you're fourth black, half Indian, did I say that already? All right. Anyway, it was very complicated, and it got more and more complicated as time went on. Till by the time of Mexican independence, there were over 100 recognized castas or castes within society. So the most you could hope for is eventually, if you kept breeding with people of Spanish blood, your descendants might be pure enough to be elevated into a higher level in society. So now there were people, and it's always good to understand. I mean, this changed over time. There was some morphing that was going on. There were people who were from the castas who became very famous military leaders, and there were explorers who also had racial mixing. So there were people who could rise within the system, but as a general rule, you were defined by what your casta was. So when we talk about, one of the things we talk about, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, is we kind of break things down into the pre-contact period, the Spanish period, the Mexican period, the American period. But is this really the Spanish period? I really want to, frame it more in terms of the containment period maybe, or the resistance period or something, because down in our territory, there's the Spanish presence was just a little 30-mile strip on the coast. Most of our lands was under our control through that whole time and throughout California. Now there's some tribes who ended up, along this coastal area, who ended up losing their entire identity. They ended up being incorporated wholesale into the missions. Because we didn't, because we had so much of our population that was outside of the missions, outside of their control, we have this mixture and this gradient that occurred. Another thing was that environmentally, we were not conducive to Spanish-style agriculture. So in the beginning, when they tried to introduce that to San Diego, it was a big flop. And what they did, even with the Indians who converted to Christianity, they allowed them to maintain their traditional lifestyles as long as they would express that they were Christian. How many of them paid lip service to that, I think is pretty evident when you look at the attacks that occurred, even the attack at the mission at San Diego, where many Indians who they thought were converted actually participated in the attack on the mission. So there's some question as to that, but a lot of these Christianized Indians who were living within their own communities provided a buffer zone then with the Indian people who were not converts. But there was still trade that was going back and forth between all these different groups. Now you get up into some other areas and where they were conducive to agriculture, to European agriculture, and the entire population, the whole tribal population got brought into the missions because they were able to feed them there, and then they got put into that intense indoctrination. And what you see in some of those tribes today, some of them, the way they identify whether or not you're a tribal member is whether or not you're listed under the census for the mission. So they go back to that record, and because that's 100% of where their population was. And for them, there was no place to go. Their territory, even their traditional lifestyles, were decimated because of the new plants and animals that were brought in. So even if they left the mission, they would go to an environment that was hostile to their traditional lifestyle. So that was very tragic. But there are many areas of California where that were completely outside the scope of the mission. Either they resisted the mission expansion and were able to stop them, or it never got that far. After Mexican independence, there were still battles that were occurring. The Chumash in Santa Barbara, Chief Estanislao in San Joaquin Valley, and that's a statue to him there, and widespread rebellions to the Secularization Act. Now, prior to the Secularization Act, there were factions within California that were battling it out with each other, and that's another presentation. But the Indian people were a key part of that. And the loyalists to Mexico were mainly from the northern part, and the southern part of California was actually people who wanted to secede. And and what they did in the South, one of the things that they did was very unusual for Spanish people or Mexican people to do, was they armed the peasants. They armed the Indians, and Mexico didn't even do that in the Mexican-American War when the Americans invaded. They did not want the peasants to have weapons, and they were too fearful of their own population, and so this was really something unique, something unusual. And what it did was it gave the Indian people in the South, they had weaponry, and so so they actually sided with the faction that was pushing for secularization, and I don't know what kind of promises that were made to them, but they said if the secularization goes through, you guys are all going to be taken care of. When the act actually passed in 1833, there were some Indians who were tied in closely with the Mexican elites who did get ranchos, but most of it went to people who were part of the elite structure in California. So for a lot of the Indian people who thought they were going to get something out of the Secularization Act, they rebelled. And they went and they joined in with the Kumeyaay who were still maintaining their independence. And so that's what happened in our territory. So we had these people who brought weapons, horses, who had knowledge of all of the goings on within the Mexican society, who came in and joined in with the free and independent Kumeyaay, we're a very tolerant people of religious beliefs, so the fact that some of them were Christians didn't bother people that much. There was competition, I think, on the religious front. But they came together and they started launching attacks against the ranchos. So after the Secularization Act, then you start seeing these ranchos falling one by one. The Secularization Act was, after Mexico got its independence, they wanted to take the mission lands and take them out of the hands of the church and secularize it, make them into private property. And so the act was passed in 1833 in Mexico to do that. But in California, pretty much after Mexican independence, the Spanish elites that had really dominated California politics were still in power. They didn't really change after the change, and Mexico sent a governor, actually a mestizo governor, to California, who really wanted to do an implementation of a Secularization Act that would really give plots of land to Indian people and really incorporate them into the state. And he was fought, and he was fought very viciously by the elites in California. And eventually, because they were at the point of having civil war and seceding from Mexico, Mexico caved in, and they sent a governor who was acceptable to the people in California, and he implemented the Secularization Act then, and so then all the ranchos got created. So many of these ranchos were in areas that were completely under Kumeyaay control. They just, on paper, they just put these ranchos and said, here, this is yours now. And so, of course, the Kumeyaay had their attacks. Tecate was destroyed in 1836. That was Bandini, very famous name in San Diego history. I think he got out with his life and 2 mules, if I remember right. Tecate, 1839, very famous story about chasing the raiders all throughout the backcountry and then getting ambushed in Jacumba. Jamul, 1837. By the 1840s, San Diego itself was being attacked by Kumeyaay. And an English traveler on the, I think it was the Sulphur, Captain Belcher, and he commented in the 1840s that San Diego was going to fall pretty soon. They tried to shore up the defenses. They brought in prisoners from Mexico to shore up the defenses in San Diego. 400 prisoners were brought up. They called it the Cholo Army. They were such a pain in the butt to the people in San Diego because they were criminals, and all of a sudden they kind of had free reign in this town, and the people, finally just said, hey, we'll take our chances with the Indians, get rid of them. And so they sent them to LA. So that's another story. So we had all these different attacks, and we were reclaiming our territory. By the 1840s, almost pushing to where we were reclaiming it all the way to the coast. So, and this was in the time just before the Americans came in, and we start the American period. So those things, those are things in our history, but they don't fit into that narrative. Not at all. There's no way you can have this wonderful, touchy-feely kind of relationship between the priests or with the ranchos and still carry forward into that narrative of how California got created. But that's not even the worst of it. The Americans absolutely extremely successful in some cases in their genocide campaigns. Through a combination of vigilantes, militias, and the U.S. Army, they were able to go in and wipe out entire ethnic groups. Had massive killings, especially in Northern California and in the Gold Country area. We escaped a lot of that. We still had, there was the institutional part of the genocide, the lack of citizenship in the United States, the blocking of our treaties. So we negotiated a treaty that would give us about 20% of what's now San Diego County. Our treaties were blocked by the California delegation to Congress. And this is in the 1850s. People were kind of, there was a big compromise that went on in order to bring California into the Union as a free state, not a slave state. And so these were in the years before the Civil War, and there was a big push. There were a lot of people who wanted to have California a slave state. There was even one proposal to run a line from about Santa Barbara across, and everything south of there would have legal slavery. So they were trying to hold the United States together, and it gave the delegation from California more clout in the Senate. And they were able to convince the Senate, hey, this is never going to be accepted by the people of California. You can't ratify these treaties. There were 17 treaties in all that were negotiated in California. And so in 1850, the Indian population was roughly equivalent to the non-Indian population. So they didn't really want the Indians to know that they weren't going to honor the treaties. So what they did was they voted it down in committee, and they placed it under seal, and they never told the Indians that these treaties were not ratified. It wasn't until 1905 before the seal was removed from that. So in the meantime, Indian people thought they had rights to their land. They thought they could go out and they built ranches. You know, many of these were vaqueros who under the Mexican system, and so they were ranchers. They were very familiar with livestock, and and they had other trades that they were familiar with, and so they built ranches, and they built homes. They fenced land, and an American would come in and say, well, you know, you're not a citizen. You can't. I can file a homestead on it, and they'd file a homestead and take the land right out from under their feet and have a pre-made house already there. If they were lucky, the American would let them stay on the land as a ranch hand and work for them. So this went on throughout the 1850s and 60s. Really, the Indian people were rounded up. Children were taken from their homes. They were so-called adopted out to families. But really, they worked as domestic servants. As soon as they turned 18, they were kicked out, or sometimes they were kept even longer. Indian people were rounded up in Northern California. Indian girls were rounded up. They'd kill the men and the older people in the village, and they'd take the girls and take them to the brothels in San Francisco. They had a real shortage of women. With the gold rush, there was a very high male population up in the northern part of the state. So if an Indian could not show that he had a job, he could be arrested for vagrancy, and then the punishment was 6 months hard labor, and the judge would hire him out. The court would hire him out to a rancher, and he'd have to work for 6 months. At the end of that time, if he didn't have a job yet, he could get rearrested for vagrancy, and it was in a sense, it was a form of slavery. Olvera Street was one of the big places where these slaves were sold. The vagrancy slaves were sold to people there. Environmental catastrophe. The introduction of the high velocity hydraulic nozzle in Northern California was used in gold mining was just catastrophic and killed many people up there who relied on the fish in the rivers. Because of the silting that occurred, the salmon runs just got decimated from this erosion that came down. Caused a lot of flooding. You know, Sacramento. If you go up to Sacramento, there's a lot of you can see where it was built up, and there's a lot of like underground Sacramento where the old level used to be. They had to actually raise the city because of the flooding that was occurring. You get down toward the delta. A lot of this was exacerbated by the hydraulic gold mining. And of course, the introduction of different plants and animals and the prohibition of the traditional land management techniques, you know, all of which had a tremendous impact. One of the first laws in California was to prohibit burning, and as they're finding more and more, especially in the last 20 years, fire science is really starting to come to terms with the fact that you need to have burning, that by not doing burning, you end up with catastrophic burning, and so. So this practice that had been occurring for thousands and thousands of years in California is making a limited amount of comeback, but due to the way that we zone our lands, it's still pretty difficult to try to put something like that together and avoid any catastrophe. So how does this damage us? You know, okay, you know. So I said it's a Santa Claus or Easter Bunny. You know, it's in that sense, what damage does it do? Eventually, you get old enough to understand what the truth is. But for for Indian people, for Kumeyaay people, and what we've seen is this narrative has some really direct impacts, especially in things like the relationship between children and teachers. I've heard of Indian kids who were educated about what happened at the missions who refused to participate in the 4th grade mission project. And they got an F from the teacher. And their parents would come in and talk to the teacher, and they'd say, no, this is in the curriculum. This is what happened. It became the belief that Indian people, they just don't want to accept the truth of what happened to them. You were in the missions. You were conquered. You're gone. And why not just accept it? Get over it. This is what you guys did. Yeah, so maybe you don't like it, but so what? This is what happened. And when the parents say, no, this is not what happened. There's something different that did happen. It puts the children in a position of having to choose between the teacher and their parents. Who are you going to believe? It damages relationships with other ethnic groups. For a long time, the Jewish community did not want us using the word genocide in reference to California. The Simon Wiesenthal Center said, no, you can't call that genocide. We have dibs on that term. Unless you have millions of people, and in California it was thousands. So we didn't have the numbers that they felt justified genocide. Maybe the Armenians, we'll let them squeeze under the term, but no, the Indians you can't. And I think part of that too was a vested interest in holding up the United States as the beacon of modern civilization, and to come in and say, well, genocide also happened here. It happened under the Constitution of the United States by God-fearing Christian people who went to church on Sunday and then went and wiped out villages on Sunday evening. So it was something that people didn't want to grapple with. But it's changing. It's changing quite a bit. And a good book that just came out a couple years ago, American Genocide, was actually written by a Jewish person. So we're seeing changes in that kind of view. Mexican Americans, sometimes they take pride in, hey, we used to be part of the Aztec Empire. This used to be part of the Aztec Empire. They don't want to let that go. This is Aztlan. This is Aztlan that you're standing on. It's our origin place, and well, maybe some of the Uto-Aztecan lands, maybe among the Coahuila or Luiseños maybe, but I don't think you can claim, the human speakers, the Kumeyaay as under part of that, and but it's something that gets perpetuated within the Latino communities, and it puts us at odds by not having this out in the open and having people who believe that, questioning our identity. And it's amazing sometimes. Now, after gaming, I think people began to realize there's Indians in California. But before 1990, you'd be amazed. I'd go to Sacramento and people would say, "You mean there's still Indians in California?" They were shocked. I heard Roger Hedgecock on the radio like 15 years ago, and I listened to him. Sorry, and he said, "Where are all these Indian tribes coming from?" And I thought, man, you were on the board of supervisors of San Diego County, and you were the mayor of San Diego, and you didn't know that there's 18 reservations in San Diego County? There were no new tribes being created at all. These are all ones that were there before you ever took political office. And I said that to the radio. I don't think he heard me. So we see that a lot when there's conflicts with people off the reservation on different types of events that occur, or different types of commercial activity on the reservation. A lot of times you'll see the opponents to the tribe will try to question the legitimacy of the tribe. Were you really here before? Can you prove it? Can you show that? Why? Where did you really come from? And there's that kind of thing. Well, the Indians are gone. The Indian Wars happened a long time ago. Why are you trying to reinvent something new here? didn't you all become Mexicans a long time ago? And then it also feeds the cycles of intergenerational trauma. And this is something that a lot of the sociologists and the psychologists recognize, that these types of events, whether you're going through genocide, whether you're going through the harshness and the brutality of things like the mission, like the boarding schools that occurred during the American period, these types of things get passed on from generation to generation, and trying to break that cycle, trying to show people that no, this isn't our lifestyle. This isn't our history. There are things that we have done that were truly amazing. We had people who went out and went out on San Diego Bay in a Thule boat to confront Cabrillo and say, "What the hell are you doing here?" We had people who resisted the missions to the point like Nawaseho, who committed suicide rather than accepting Christianity, even though Father Serra himself had promised freedom for him if he would just convert. But he wanted to stay with his traditional beliefs to the point that he committed suicide rather than convert. So these stories, I think, are really important, and they're not captured in the narrative that we have of California. We've been erased out of that portion, and so bringing that back in, to me, these are very interesting stories, and so maybe I'm biased, but I think even non-Indians would be interested in these struggles and in the stories of people who stood up to other people that were coming in and who managed to maintain their identity and through the years. So there are many aspects of the Kumeyaay and California Indian history that undermine the California narrative. There are many adherents to the narrative, and some of whom actually have commercial interest in keeping it. There are many reasons for Americans to resist acknowledging it. It's a harsh thing to hear about your own country, our own country, especially the role in early California. And we do have, there's been a concerted effort on many different fronts within our community and with other tribes in California to correct the narrative and to bring these hundreds of different stories that exist here in California, bring them out so that we can show them, show who we are, show what our history has been, and show the survival that we have been able to accomplish and what led to where we are today. So I'm not going to read all these, but there's a lot of different organizations from Kumeyaay Community College, which you heard about. Sign up for class. You still have time to sign up for classes. We have history classes, ethnoecology, where we talk about our traditional land management. We have a Kumeyaay philosophy class. So there's different types of classes that you could take there. Different communities. We have 4 ejidos in Mexico. We have other populations that don't have a land base. We're even working with Wikipedia. There's different colleges that have programs where they've been trying to help to bring these stories forward, and to help to work with us to find a way to highlight some of these things. And so, of course, many individual Kumeyaay who are working on it. So I'll conclude now with just a final statement. I've been asked many times, well, why don't you guys make statues to some of these people so you know about the leaders of the revolt against the mission, or Nawaseho, or some of these other people in our history, and tribal leaders. And in our traditional culture, when someone dies, you're not supposed to say their name. So and that, if you do, you call them back from the next world. You want them to move on into the next world, and so it's really it's a bad thing to try to keep pulling them back, keep dragging on their heels, and they can't get over there, and they keep hearing their name mentioned, and they want to come back and see what's going on. So that's changing over time. We do have, gradually there are places where people see that it's important that we do state the name of people who were involved in different things. But we've never really gotten into putting statues to individual people. That's never been something that I've ever heard any kind of a big push for within our community, and I think it's because of those roots in our traditional culture. But we do have monuments all over Southern California. The first missions were built with thatched roofs, and the flaming arrows of Indian people who were fighting against this Spanish domination caused them to shift to tile roofs. So the tile roofs on missions were essentially caused by us. That got incorporated into the mission-style architecture. That got passed on to the Spanish-style architecture. That got incorporated into the red tile roofs and stucco that you see in housing all over Southern California. So whenever you drive by one of those red tile roofed houses, you know that is a monument to the resistance of the Kumeyaay people. Thank you.